Welcome into another edition of the Hang Time Podcast. Sekou Smith here in Atlanta. John Schumann is in New Jersey, and John Hartzell's behind the glass as always. Why waste any time? Let's just get right into it. Our guest this week is here strategically placed, of course, after the NBA trade deadline lived up to every bit of its hype last week. Drama everywhere, highlighted by all-in moves by the Philadelphia 76ers, Toronto Raptors, and Milwaukee Bucks at the top of the East. And, of course, no movement whatsoever on the Anthony Davis situation in New Orleans. David Griffin, an NBA TV analyst, former general manager of the Cleveland Cavaliers, friend of the show, and one of my favorite dudes. Griff, how you doing, man? I know your schedule is chock full, so we appreciate you taking a few minutes.
Yeah, no problem at all. Really glad to do it, guys. And it was an amazing deadline. Just incredible. Yeah. One of the most eventful I could remember.
Yeah. The Sixers obviously went out and added Tobias Harris, Griff. They're going for it, obviously. That front office staff clearly put their heads together and said, let's get this thing done. Let's get rid of Markelle Fultz on top of it. Let's add Tobias, and some other, hopefully, quality depth for them. They've looked great since the deadline, obviously. Do you think that they've done enough to put themselves over the top potentially in the East?
Well, these last two games are any indication they certainly have. I think they have the potential, and they've shown this, that they really haven't even had time to have a practice together. They have the potential to be a stifling defensive team. That starting lineup they put out there is just huge everywhere. And when Embiid is as motivated as he is right now, and he's playing in a totally different gear defensively than I think he has the vast majority of the season. He's always good, but he's been phenomenal to start games since Tobias got there. When he's playing at that level defensively, it's hard to even make an entry pass. They're so big. And offensively, obviously, the floor spacing elements of Tobias is real. But it's one thing if you're a guy who can make 38% of your shots. It's another thing if the defense treats you like you make 48. And because he's shooting 43%, and the defense is treating him like that, it has a really profound impact on their ability to drive the lane and has made Ben Simmons infinitely better as well. So I'm excited about their potential for sure.
If we're looking at the Sixers as one of those teams, obviously, Griff, and I love what Toronto did, add Marc Gasol. I think there's no doubt Niko Mirotic takes the Bucks and puts them in a different light. The arms race in the East, at the very top there, Boston sits out. Do they have the luxury of doing that this time around based on what they've done the past couple of years? Am I missing something as to why they wouldn't do anything?
Well, I think from a talent perspective, they do have the luxury for that because they had so many pieces that they weren't getting the full capability from that I think they were sort of growing into it. Heading into deadline, I think they were 10-1 in their previous 11 or 9-1 in their previous 10. I mean, they had played really, really well. Kyrie, since everything happened relative to the leadership component of things and the apologizing to LeBron and whatnot, he's actually really led by example in a positive way for them, I think. You see him much better at the point of attack defensively. He's distributing more. I thought he was really playing to the better of his angels, quite frankly, and had been playing well. And the rest of those pieces looked like they were on the come. But now we blow a 28-point lead, an 18-point lead, and Marcus Morris is talking about your chemistry's bad. So if you're in that locker room, if you're with the team all the time, like Danny certainly would be, you can sense when the chemistry is off. And if you're not all pulling in the same direction when the only thing that's going to mark success is winning a championship, you've got to do something to get everybody pulling in the same direction. So I don't know if there was anything they actually could have did better. Most of these trades, with some exceptions, are done on the edges. And that team is so deep. I don't know what they could have done to put themselves in a better position to compete in a sustainable way. I just know that it's pretty clear there's something amiss there. And I wonder when we're going to start to put some of this on Brad. This is the first year Brad Stevens has ever entered the year with expectation of winning, that he's supposed to get to the finals. And it takes a long time. It takes time for it to gel. And I think it's hard for coaches to go through that for the first time. Brad's sort of walking on eggshells for the first time. So this will be a learning experience for him. And you can see the learning curve has been steep.
Yeah, I think there's also just there might be just some hard-headed individuals in that locker room. And I use the word individuals because that's the word that Marcus Morris used the other day when describing their situation, that it's a bunch of individuals and not guys playing for each other, basically the exact words that he used. And that's some damning words. But it's amazing. This team, if you look at their point differential, it's better than it was last season, right? Like they are third in point differential and they can look so good at times. And then, obviously they have these moments of flakiness, I guess. I don't know how to say it. And I don't, it's hard to put your finger on it because overall they're a good offensive team. They're a good defensive team. They have obviously the offensive talent and they have the size and defenders, especially up front, to get stops. And we've seen, them dominate Philadelphia. We've seen them win games against all the other good teams, basically.
Tainted spirit, man. They got what I call tainted spirit.
You know what? Tuesday night, I think it's in Philly, is going to be fascinating because Philly is now coming off these 2 big wins with their new lineup. Boston seems to be in this bad place, but over the last 16 months, the Celtics are 9-2 against the Sixers. They're the Sixers' nemesis for sure. So I'm absolutely fascinated by that game tomorrow night. As much as we're looking forward to All-Star and a lot of teams are probably looking forward to getting the break, that game just is one you circle on the calendar.
Well, and if they're spiritually tainted, Sekou, you're going to see it. I mean, it's one of those things. And this is why I said what I said about Brad, who I think is a phenomenal coach, by the way. But it's easy to get buy-in when it's Marcus Smart and young kids that don't know any better. But once those young kids have success, like Tatum and Brown did last year, with a lot of usage, and you go to the conference finals, you make your bones as a coach when you can get buy-in from stars. That's why coaching stars is hard. Everybody thinks that putting together a superstar team is the formula for success. There have been a lot of superstar teams that didn't win because they didn't enjoy the journey together. And Ty Lue gets no credit at all for out coaching several people, including Brad, late in games because the talent got all the credit. Well, the fact that he got them all moving in the same direction was what made it possible. So I think this is really the next step in Brad's evolution is can he generate buy-in from hard-headed, big-name guys? And Jason Tatum thinks of himself as a star now. Jaylen Brown wants to be more of a star. And that's why Marcus Morris was yelling at Jaylen for not being engaged enough because he was sort of coasting like a star would. And he's too young for that and doesn't know when to pick a spot. So I think they have all of the talent they need. If they can make it sort of coalesce from a leadership perspective, then they're going to be just as good as John talked about because they do have those moments of greatness. But this is when you make your bones as a coach.
Does Kyrie have and I know you mentioned that you liked, him being led by his better angels. Does he have the makeup to be the kind of leader they're going to need right now? Do you think he's far along enough in his own development, Griff, to be the guy who can orchestrate that and maybe take some of that pressure off Brad Stevens? Or is it somebody else maybe on that roster who's going to have to help row the boat in that direction?
I don't think any of these guys, Sekou, have it to do it themselves. Like LeBron always needs really quality veteran guys in the locker room who can sort of recalibrate everybody when the LeBron experience gets heavy. There's so much noise around the LeBron James-led team that it's incumbent upon Tyson Chandler and now Rondo, and in the past, Mike Miller and James Jones and Kendrick Perkins and his Kyle Korver, as many high character, Richard Jefferson, Channing Frye, guys you can put in the locker room who can recalibrate everybody and keep people light enough to deal with that much burden and that much expectation. And if he doesn't have the right people in his locker room, he's not capable of it either because nobody does this alone. So the answer is no. Kyrie's not ready for this by himself. And if the mix in your locker room doesn't have enough veteran leaders who can recalibrate the young guys, you have a problem on your hands.
Yeah. Griff, the LeBron subject, of course, leads me to a larger question about the deadline and what we saw 10 days out, where you have Anthony Davis and his representatives go public with a request to be traded from New Orleans. And obviously the Lakers became the centerpiece of this because of LeBron's comments earlier in the season about wanting to play with Anthony Davis and subsequently every other, living and breathing giant that walks the planet and could possibly help him win another championship. How do you protect yourself And can you, as an organization, in this day and age when star players are now dictating, their own path, contract, how many years you have, be damned. They, if I want out, I'm going to make it public. I'm going to orchestrate my way out of this situation. Paul George has done it. Kyrie has done it. Kawhi Leonard has done it. I mean, we can go down the list of guys. Jimmy Butler has done it a couple times. How does an organization fortify itself from this when, you get it right, you draft the right type of talent, you're trying to grow and develop them and build a championship team, and then he says, I want out?
So it's interesting. I think in the New Orleans Pelicans situation, it's a little fresher in our minds because it just happened. And I think every one of those circumstances you talked about sort of speak to the same thing. And it's, listen, if you raise a family that loves each other enough to tell each other what they need to hear, you stay in front of things like this. And your players need to understand that you always get more with honey than you do with vinegar. And their agents need to know the same thing. And the reality is the Pelicans didn't step to the fore the day Anthony Davis signed Rich Paul and Clutch and have the conversation of, listen, you didn't sign Clutch because you want to re-sign here and we're all going to sing Kumbaya together. So talk to me about where you live. Talk to me about where your heart is. What does Anthony Davis need to be happy? And at that point, if you put Anthony Davis on notice that you understand what the game is and you partner with Rich Paul and Clutch Sports, you probably move him in the off season in a way that Kevin O'Connor moved Darren Williams, much more under cover of night. You make the deal you want to make and you stay in front of it. But when you live in the world of, I'm going to ignore it and hope the situation goes away, you can't deal with stars like that. You can't deal with their agents like that. This required proactivity on everyone's part. So what happened was Rich Paul and Clutch got to the point where they figured, all right, well, it's now or never. We got to get out of here. And that was an adversarial act. And it didn't need to be adversarial. So your role as an organization is never let anybody feel like they need to take an adversarial act. Partner with everybody. Look, you're either with me or you're against me. And if you're not, just tell me and I'll move you on. It's exactly what we did in Cleveland. Had that same conversation with many, many players. Look, there's no shame in saying you can't do this and be joyful in the pursuit. There's no shame in that. Where there is shame is you can't do this and you bring our house down in the process. And just tell me you're not happy and I'll do what I can do about somebody else. And you have to make people feel bound to one another that way. And that was not done in this circumstance. And the Lakers failed mightily in their pursuit of this situation because they made the Pelicans feel like they were the adversary who was driving all of this. So, of course, Dell didn't want to trade him to the Lakers. They were the adversary.
It's a great way of looking at it.
Well said.
Shu, this is for you and Griff. When we focus our attention on some of these big deals, and I started thinking about this last night, guys, when I was going back and watching Kenneth Faried and how effective he's been in his role with the Rockets since he joined them. We always focus our attention on the big trades. We're going to be watching Marc Gasol. We're going to be watching Mirotic. We're going to be watching, Tobias Harris. We're going to be seeing how they fit on these big teams. Was there a deal that went down for either one of you that was kind of under the radar that you think will end up being more significant, than we're giving it credit for right now based on the magnitude of what it looks like?
It's interesting. I think from an under the radar move standpoint, I look at the Tobias Harris trade from the Clipper perspective. Everybody focuses on how good Philadelphia can be in the here and now because of it. It's sort of like the NBA's equivalent of a bolo punch. The Clippers are like, don't look at what we're doing over here. Don't look at what we're doing over here. Oh, bang, we have room for 2 max free agents in Los Angeles. They're going to be in that position. And they are running their organization incredibly, incredibly well. They're turning over every stone. They've employed people like Lee Jenkins who are outside the box, who are going to help build the story of their free agency and for their free agents. They've got the wealthiest owner in the NBA who loves the game so much. He's going on the road and sitting courtside at games. They're being very, very thoughtful, and they are building in a very sustainable way. So we always get so caught up in, wow, look how good Philadelphia is, that we lose sight of the fact that the steps that are being taken by teams like the Clippers right now are what's going to set the stage for them to be the next juggernaut in the league. And at some point, they're going to be. It may take some time. They may not land everything they're looking to do this offseason, but their practice facility is second to none. They're going to have a new building eventually coming online. And with everything that they're going to get to sing, the song they're going to get to sing for free agents, eventually it's going to recruit itself because they're building something that stands for something. And people lose sight of that when we focus on the here and now.
I actually really like the Thursday deal that they made, just as far as staying competitive and maybe staying in that 8th spot in the West, trading Avery Bradley for Garrett Temple and JaMychal Green.
Totally agree.
I thought that was just as far, like if just in a vacuum, that was a great trade. Because, Bradley has this reputation as a great defender. And believe me, I would not want to be guarded by that guy for 94 feet. Like, I would not want to have to carry the ball, dribble the ball up the floor with that guy in my shirt. But he's a 6'2" guard, right? And so there's a limit to how much of an effect he can have, positive effect he can have defensively. Garrett Temple is bigger and can sort of have that sort of same role with that team. And then adding JaMychal Green, a 4 who can shoot, space the floor, keeps that team viable. I think and Green will complement, Lou Williams and Montrezl Harrell off their bench pretty well for these last 30 games or so. I love that deal a lot, and it didn't hurt them one bit long term. Both those guys are expiring contracts, Green being a restricted free agent.
No, I totally agree. And now the Bolo punch part of that is they also get Zubac, which to me is a tremendous deal. At one point, he was one of the 5 names in the package for AD, right? And he's a guy that has a future and an upside, and his cap hold will be so low, they'll be able to keep him on his cap hold while they pursue free agents. They may have gotten their future starting 5 out of that deal, and nobody talked about it at all. So when I'm talking about the NBA equivalent of the Bolo punch, it's exactly that, John. They make the deal to be more competitive in the here and now, and people are sort of oblivious to what is going on the other side. And that's really where the magic happens.
And I've said it before on this podcast. I'll say it again. The job that Doc Rivers has done, keeping that team competitive, given the transitional state of the roster, where just a few months, a year ago, they were Blake Griffin and DeAndre Jordan, and a little bit before that, they were Chris Paul, and now they've turned into what they are now. And 6 months from now, they may be completely different, and they've got all these guys on expiring contracts. The fact that they're winning games and playing together just never ceases to amaze me. How they've done that with such a roster in complete flux, where guys don't know if they're going to be around long term.
No, I totally agree. And Sekou, we talked about that last year, that the job Doc did with that team with all those injuries, probably his best coaching job of his career, and he didn't even make the playoffs. That's how challenging that season was, and what a great job he did.
Yeah. On the flip side of the teams that are prepping for July 1st and kind of a quicker turnaround, Griff, what's the strategy when you're a struggling team and you're kind of watching from the periphery at the trade deadline? It's going to be difficult for you to get involved in the free agent mix at all, but you've got a draft where there are maybe 3-4 game changers, guys who could really impact a franchise and help flip things around. Do you save up all the chips and prepare for kind of a long grinding summer, or do you hope that there's some way you slip into the free agency mix as maybe that third team or as an option to get yourself on stable footing maybe sooner rather than later? And I think about teams like the Hawks and not so much Cleveland right now. I realize their rebuild is maybe at a more ground floor stage. But there are some teams that seem like they're in that limbo. Obviously the Knicks are going to be trying to be a factor, in free agency. But for those teams that aren't going to be big free agent players in terms of the superstars, but maybe want to accelerate their process a little bit, how do you slide into that mix?
Yeah, so it's interesting with the Atlanta squad that you talked about. I think they're still pretty early in the rebuild process. The most important thing you have to do is recognize how good you are or aren't, and be very objective about that, and be very comfortable in the space of we're not ready yet to flip the switch and go for it. The biggest mistakes we make as a team is all designed around believing you're better than you are, and you push go too soon. You bring in money that's eventually going to choke you off, and you end up landlocked in the middle like Charlotte is. They're a team with virtually no flexibility of any kind and nobody that they're recruiting to either, right? Kemba's not under contract, so they don't even have a destination player. And when you're going through this rebuild process, I think the thing that's so significant about Atlanta is John Collins is really good. And Trae Young has been really under the radar good because Luka's so good, you lose sight of how good Trae has been. I think ultimately, though, you've got to look at it from the standpoint, and Travis Schlenk and his staff have to look at it from the standpoint of, well, Westbrook and Durant were what OKC built around. Are my guys Westbrook and Durant? Are we that good? If you're not that good, then consolidating young assets, a better young asset, is sometimes the thing to do. And they're going to have a great draft pick. You just have to stay the course, Sekou. I mean, it's hard, and it's one of those things where you look at it and you go, if we're in the lottery more than 4 years, we'll probably be in there 10. And that's the way it works. I mean, historically, that's how it goes. Sacramento hasn't made the playoffs in, 11, 12 years. So you've got to get out by the end of year 4. But leading up to that, you've got to be patient enough to accept we're just not ready to hit go yet.
I got a fun post-deadline question for the two of you. I actually asked it on Twitter last night. Uh-huh. What post-deadline roster is the most motley crew of all, in that it's just a bunch of guys that have been thrown together for a bunch of disparate reasons? I have some candidates. Cleveland is one, for sure, where you have Kevin Love and Tristan Thompson, the holdovers. You have Osman and Colin Sexton, the sort of the building blocks, I guess. And then you've got just a bunch of guys from a bunch of
the ghost of J.R. Smith.
And just a bunch of guys that were acquired because they came along with a first or second round pick, basically. Mm-hmm. Another one is Memphis, because you have Mike Conley, the longtime franchise cornerstone. You have Jaren Jackson, the future franchise cornerstone. And then you have, the other day they had a rotation where they had 10-man rotation where the 10 guys were on 6 different rosters in training camp. Where you had Joakim Noah from the Knicks in training camp. You had the guys from Toronto, Valanciunas, Miles, DeLon Wright. Mm-hmm. You had Bruno, who was in Houston's training camp. Avery Bradley with the Clippers. I mean, I was watching this game and it was like, wait a minute, Avery Bradley is on the floor with CJ Miles and DeLon Wright. Like, this is like, it was just so bizarre. So that's another one. Washington is one where you have Beal and sort of these, and Satoransky and Thomas Bryant, who's become, a starting center out of nowhere. And then you have the Chicago guys that came in the Otto Porter trade. Like, is there any one? I think Memphis is the winner, but I'm willing to take input from you two.
So
I'm going to defer to Griff since he's had to put together rosters before. I'll let you go first, Griff.
I love this question, John. I'm actually going to spend some time with this and think about it, and really, I'll text you an answer that's a little more thoughtful. But I love this question. One of my good friends who's a team president of another team, and I'm going to leave his name out of this, uses the verbiage that I've always really appreciated with rosters that are really convoluted, like Memphis. It's called a collection of Hasarai. And Memphis is a collection of Hasarai. There's no question. And the reason is that there's such a disparate connection. Like, when you look at their gap between the 18 and 19-year-old Jaren Jackson Jr. and the 31-year-old Mike Conley, those are really high variance players, and their age gap is so huge. Typically, when you're building a championship nucleus, most every championship nucleus that's ever won titles was 4 years apart. Their age range is 4 years apart because they're all contemporaries that way. There's layers in there, but you sort of catch a little bit of everything. And in this situation, they're a whole generation apart. It is a fascinating thing when you've got two players that good that are that far apart age-wise, and then the Hasarai in the middle. It's really interesting.
I think my theory with Conley, Griff, is that he'll be easier to move in the summer when teams have more cap flexibility, when people know where they're drafting and, draft picks are in place and stuff. I think as much as he can be desired around the league, it was probably difficult to find the right trade in season, and it'll be much easier come July 1st.
I agree. And I think one of the reasons for that, John, is he hasn't made this adversarial. He's just showing up and playing hoop. Yeah. And he's going to keep competing the way he does. Now, there's some risk in that because he's been injury prone. But if he can make it through the rest of this year healthy, I agree with you that just the preponderance of cap space in the offseason makes it easier to deal him. I don't think they're going to find it very easy, no matter when they do it, to actually get asset value for him. And that's one of the things that I think they're going to really struggle with, is just acceptance of, look, this is where you are. You rode that way too long. You invested in the wrong group for too long. And this is why I'm talking about you have to be in front of that and acknowledge you're just not good enough and be comfortable accepting that. They rode that way too long. So it's natural they're going to get less for Mike than they could have.
Yeah, I mean, just look at the package they got for Gasol. I mean, I like all of those players to some degree, but even, DeLon Wright I didn't realize he's 26 years old already, and he'll be 27 in a couple of months. Like, he's not the prospect or anything close to it that you'd expect or that you'd want in a major deal like that.
Yeah, I agree.
I'm going to pose a different type of question to you guys. Of all the teams with abundant cap space going into July 1st, and we don't know what's going to happen with the lottery. We don't know who wins a championship this year. We know nothing. Just based on what we know right now, available cap space, the free agent class that's available, which front office would you rather be of the teams flush with cap space in an opportunity awaiting them this summer? The Knicks, I believe, have the number one spot with the most cap space. But certainly we got, the Lakers, the Clippers, and all these other teams, Brooklyn, all of these different franchises involved. Where would you want to be calling those shots from, Griff, John, if you were in that mix?
I'll defer to the former.
That's not fair. So I think relative to, I think of this like if I'm going to recruit to something, if I'm going to have what I've built sort of recruit itself, I'd rather be where Brooklyn and the Clippers are. They're both in big markets with the right kind of infrastructures. They've been doing all of the right things, maximizing as much of their asset value as possible along the way. They're going to put together remarkable pitches to guys. It will recruit itself. And in the case of each of those teams, neither one of them has like the destination player that unquestionably is going to recruit someone to come. But they have the right template. They've built a culture of accountability. And from a coaching perspective, they've got sweat equity. They've developed young players. And so I look at it thinking, if I were an agent who would speak to me most clearly, it's probably one of those two teams.
I agree with that. I totally agree. And as far as the talent that is on those rosters, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, when you watch him, you love him, but he hasn't had the most consistent rookie year. And then with Brooklyn, right. Man, if Karis LeVert didn't get hurt, how good could he look right now? And it's awesome that he's back, played one game so far, and maybe, he can develop or, get back to being the player that he was over these last couple months. But man, that would have been fun if he had been healthy all year, and to see just how close he is to being, an all-star. And heck, they have an all-star on their roster right now, but D'Angelo Russell is a restricted free agent. And it's going to be fascinating with that team where they prioritize keeping Russell versus trying to fill a position of need, which is either the two forward positions, because when you look at it, they have Spencer Dinwiddie, they have LeVert, they have Joe Harris under contract. That's three guards right there. As good as Russell has been, you have to wonder what's the cost for retaining him and how much value does he add if he's with those other three guards on the roster versus, filling the big hole that they have at the forward positions.
And I think in both of those cases, you've also got coaches that have a lot of street cred right now with players. I think people are watching Brooklyn from afar and appreciative of Kenny Atkinson. And Doc Rivers carries a lot of sway, particularly with veterans that are of the age of the guys that are going to get full max money. And, again, the Clippers have Jerry West, who's going to show up in the meeting as well. And he might throw a wrinkle at it or two that you don't think about, but that's not a small thing. And so I just think they're both really uniquely positioned. And I agree with you on the D'Angelo Russell front. I don't know what that looks like, but I like that they have the optionality to decide.
Yeah. And I agree, like what you said when we were talking about the Celtics early in this conversation about buy-in. Brooklyn has buy-in from all these guys that are all a lot of them just fighting to earn their place in this league. And there's buy-in from top to bottom, where you have D'Angelo Russell who makes a mistake and then sits for most of the fourth quarter of a close game, and then comes back and just has another huge game the next night out, where that guy he has matured enough where he can, and he has bought in enough where he can where Kenny Atkinson can sit him down the stretch of a close game and not worry about him, how he's going to respond 2 nights later.
Yeah, and I always wonder how long you can get away with keeping a group like that intact before the infection starts, before somebody has to get I'm serious. You know this, Griff, before somebody's got to get a new contract, or somebody wants to, somebody sees someone else climbing the ladder and wants to be an all-star, and then that disease of me clicks in. I mean, it's just, I like watching the development of a team in the stage that Brooklyn's in. I'm going to hate when it starts tearing apart at some point. And it comes. It's just inevitable. That's the way it works. But to see so many young guys grinding away in the lab together, Dinwiddie, LeVert, Russell, Joe Harris, and I don't mean young in terms of age, but I'm saying in terms of their establishment in the league. I like watching Jared Allen, who I think's been fantastic. Again, you guys mentioned it. Kenny Atkinson and Sean Marks, the staffs, they've done a really nice job, because that was a competitive, grinding team before they hit this point, before they got to the point where they were actually staring at an opportunity to make the playoffs. It's hard to live through those years. I've covered teams that were brutal, that, tough to watch as they were making that journey from where they've been in the lottery year after year to trying to be respectable in the playoff team. I hope the people in Brooklyn, I hope the fans have enjoyed it, because you don't get to see the payoff all the time. Sometimes you see the ugly part and the payoff never shows up.
The fan base grows in Brooklyn.
Yeah, for sure. And it's cool because, you talked about what they were doing, in terms of the way they've raised everyone there. There's an awful lot to be said for player development. And Atlanta's doing the same thing, by the way. Lloyd Pierce is doing an unbelievable job from a player development standpoint. So very often, if you properly coach, motivate, and empower the 11th pick in the draft over 2 or 3 years, you don't always have to get the number 1 pick to be successful. And I think people lose sight of the fact that when we look at this as being totally binary and it's compete for a championship or tank, well, when you're tanking and not developing players, you're going to be terrible into the future, whether you wanted to be or not. And teams like Brooklyn and the Clippers are doing a really good job. Dallas is another one of these teams, by the way, with Rick Carlisle. They were too good to really bottom out. He was going to get so much out of what he had, they couldn't really bottom out. And I think that's a real credit to their organizations, and that's why they're going to be able to recruit free agents, because they're not viewed as sort of a factory for young kids.
Interesting. Griff, appreciate your time as always. It's going to be an interesting stretch run of this regular season into the playoffs. And then, you get all of 2 days to breathe before we dive right in on the draft and free agency around that corner, summer league and the whole deal. When did the league stop having an actual offseason in the calendar? I mean, maybe never for you, Griff, but at least reporters, we used to be able to hide out for 2-3 weeks in August. Now we don't even get that anymore.
Everybody in my generation in the NBA gets married, has kids, all of that if they can do it in August. That was always the month that was safe. and now it's less and less safe. But I think what you're seeing are the people that run franchises do it really well when they've got an incredibly deep front office, and you can still take time. If you don't find a way to take time, then you end up in a situation where you just melt down at the wrong time.
No doubt about it. Griff, appreciate it, man. We'll catch you on the radio, on NBA TV, and everywhere else, man. As always, thanks for joining us here on the Hang Time Podcast.
Griff.
Thanks, brothers. Enjoyed it.
All right, now. Always good to talk to David Griffin. He's our in-house GM now at NBA Digital. We cheat picking his brain, and great to let everybody else hear him school you on a little bit of the inner workings of the front office job in the NBA here on the Hang Time Podcast. Week 17 power rankings are out. I know we normally talk power rankings on the show on Mondays. We skipped that this week just to kind of wrap up the trade deadline and get some insights from David Griffin about what went on. Top 5 teams this week: the Bucks, the Warriors, the Thunder, the Raptors, the Sixers. Strong group heading into All-Star Weekend. Be sure to read the full rankings at NBA.com/power-rankings. There's another item shoe that people need to check out as we head to Charlotte later this week for the 68th All-Star Game. Check out Jordan Week on NBA.com, and it's there all week long leading up to the festivities. Special videos, features, and more, coordinated by our own Lamont Calloway at NBA.com with contributions from across the roster. Very interesting stuff, cool videos. I've watched pretty much most of it already. You're going to enjoy it. If you're a Jordan fiend, shoe, you're really going to enjoy it because we travel to Wilmington, North Carolina, and kind of dig into his past.
I've been there.
Go along with the journey all the way up to now. And I know you're a Wilmington expert. The Schumans congregate in that neighborhood in the summer every year. You'll be interested, I'm sure, to see some of the stuff that's uncovered about Jordan and his roots. So check that out, Jordan Week on NBA.com all week long. And, you get a chance to relive some of his best moments and also learn a few things maybe you didn't know.
DeAndre Jordan we're talking about?
No, not DeAndre. Michael Jeffrey. Michael Jeffrey, Wilmington's finest. We'll be back on Thursday with another episode, previewing a little bit of what's going to happen in Charlotte during All-Star Weekend. We'll have a special guest with us, Shu, so make sure you tune in, everybody. And be sure to subscribe to Hang Time on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts for new episodes all season long. Make sure you leave a review. We'll see you right here next time on the Hang Time Podcast. Hang Time Podcast.